All right, so we have been away for a couple of weeks, and now we are back together with the book of Job. I have 3 weeks left to land the plane, right? So all of you have been saying, he's been saying an awful lot. Just wait. We're going to come to some answers. We're going to come. It's going to be helpful. I promise we'll get there. We're getting to that point. So we have 3 weeks to finish up our study of the book of Job. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So we kind of started landing the plane a couple weeks ago, and we're going to continue looking through the Yahweh speeches today a little bit more. Let me grab my Bible. It's important. If for no other reason, it just makes it look like I read it sometimes if we have it close. Okay. So for review, we did this last week or 2 weeks ago, so we're not going to do this part again. But it is helpful from time to time for you to try and summarize the story of the book in a few sentences. And it's helpful, especially if you kind of think, what would I have said 2.5 months ago if someone had said summarize the story of the book of Job in a few sentences? And what would you say now? And it's neat to be able to think through, like, oh, I've actually grown in my understanding and exposure to the book and understanding a little bit more about the speech cycles and how the friends work in those cycles, and then how Yahweh's speech comes towards the end. So it is helpful to just realize that you've got these building blocks and you're able to put them together. Okay. So our key sections, just by way of review, as we're kind of continually reinforcing the structure in here, at the beginning, we have Job's trials. That's the story, part of the story we're all very familiar with. God and Satan have their conversation. Satan comes and he takes away all of Job's prosperity, and Job remains faithful. Then we have Job 3, Job cursing his birth. That kind of sets the whole rest of the book in motion. He curses the day of his birth. He doesn't curse God, but he curses the day of his birth, and then his friends start responding. And in chapter 4 through 27, we have the 3 speech cycles. We spent a lot of time looking at those, at how you have Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar taking turns bashing Job. Job comes back and answers each one of them, and Job also answers God, right? Like he'll pray to God fairly regularly in these speech cycles, and he's the only one who prays to God. The 3 friends don't ever talk to God. They only talk to Job. Job talks to the friends and God. And he has we looked at some of the strong language that he has, where he'll even accuse God of injustice at times. And then we got to Job 28, which I called the interlude of wisdom, the narrator's kind of insertion that as a structural transition point. And then they're all different colors on purpose, because after Job 28, we start seeing a mirror image, right? So then Job 29 through 31, we have Job's final speech. So just like you had 3 dialogue cycles right before Job 28, right after 28, you've got 3 monologues. You have Job's speech, Elihu's speeches in brackets because we haven't talked about that yet, and then the Yahweh speeches, which is where we are today. So you kind of see that there's a balance in the book. And Job 28 is kind of the structural middle point. So you've got 3 speeches right before it, 3 speech cycles before it, and then you've got 3 monologues, extended speeches right after it. And then you've got Job's confession, ? Is that a confession? We'll get to that, I don't know, maybe next week. Job 42, 1 through 6, which is kind of the parallel to Job 3. Just like Job 3 are his first words that set the activity in motion most of the book, you get a small response by Job at the end, which functions to conclude the book. And then you get an actual conclusion, a narrative conclusion with Job's restoration at the end of chapter 42. So again, it's just neat when you look at the way these books are structured, or this book is structured, it's very intentional, right? This kind of design is not an accident. The way that the author builds everything to have a mirror image to show that this is a highly structured, highly intentional, deep book that requires deep analysis, right? So this is our overview of now the book as a whole, and we're going to keep looking at the Yahweh speeches. We looked at the first speech, chapter 38 and 39 a couple weeks ago. We're going to look at chapter 40 and 41 here this morning. So these are all the questions. We looked at these that we need to answer. Last time we met, we just answered this first one. What do we do with God's first speech? This week, we're going to try and answer 3 questions. What is the significance of Job's silence? What do we do with God's second speech? And what do we do with Job's confession? And then we'll not get to all of those this week, and then we'll start working on the rest of them in our weeks that remain. Okay, so by way of review, what do we do with Yahweh's first speech? So this is Job chapter 38 and 39. And so this is what we looked at the last time we met. And for me, one of the important questions of the book, the way I put it together, is figuring out God's tone in Job 38. Not Isaiah 10, Job 38. So who remembers or would be able to share with those who weren't here what we talked about with Yahweh's tone, with the Lord's tone with Job? Okay, maybe let's ask it this way. What are our options for how God is talking to Job here? What's one way that we tend to read these questions in Job 38? So in Job 38, like verse 2, he says, who is this that obscures my... No, let's start there. Let's look at verse 4. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? And he goes on and on and asks those questions. I tried to say it with as little emotion as possible. What kind of tone could we give God with those questions? What's one option? Authority, an authoritative tone. Good. Kind of a scolding tone, right? That's right. There's times, I think we did the exercise where I had you read it to each other first without me giving any kind of insight into it, and kind of ask, like, how many of us tended to have a sarcastic tone, right? And the answer was most of us in the groups tended to have a fairly sarcastic tone for God when you were taking turns reading these questions. And most of our English translations kind of lean us that way to make to read them a little bit more sarcastically, right? Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know, right? Like you can hear it in the way that the translations come off, that God is authoritative, but authoritative in a way that he's kind of like really letting Job have it. And that's a fairly common interpretation of Yahweh in these chapters, that Yahweh kind of comes in his largeness and really puts Job in his place, right? Like that's kind of the language that a lot of interpreters will use. And what we want to say, or what I wanted to say, is that I don't read God as sarcastic with these questions. And I don't want to, and I think there's some problems with reading God as sarcastic. One is that puts God on the side of the friends. Because who has been sarcastic with Job for 20-something chapters? It's the friends. There's been all kinds of sarcasm. We didn't get a chance to look at a ton of this, but there's sarcastic back and forth with each other. Job is sarcastic with the friends are sarcastic with Job. So if we read God as sarcastic here, we wind up putting him with the friends against Job. And the book doesn't want us to do that, right? The book doesn't want us to read God as being aligned with the friends. He's very much against the friends at the end of the book. So the sarcastic reading has some problems with it within the book. I've got problems with it theologically in that as the book is formed, we identify with Job. He has our sympathy, right? As readers, everything about the book is designed to make us sympathize with Job. Well, then if God comes in and is sarcastic with Job, the way the book is designed makes us kind of go, wait a minute, I think I'm on Job's side on this one. Like, he hasn't, the friends are the ones who really need this response. So there's another way of taking these questions, right? We're still looking at the same evidence, we're still looking at the same verses, but instead of reading them sarcastically, we read them as well-intentioned rhetorical questions, right? That Job already knows the answer to, that God knows Job knows the answer to, that are meaningfully intended, right? So, and I kind of gave the reading, right, where it's something like God looking at Job going, Job, you understand this. Who is it that laid the measuring stick of the earth? Come on, Job. Who is it who set the earth on its pillars? You know this. I know that you know this. Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? No, you know that you weren't, right? So it's, instead of being sarcastic, it's creating this community of knowledge between Yahweh and Job that's well-intentioned. Is this making, yeah, Craig? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And 38:2, so Craig's drawing our attention to 38:2, that he darkens counsel with words without knowledge. That's the key verse for this speech. Job's problem is one of knowledge. But what's fascinating is that he's not taught new information. Job is not given new information in chapter 38, which is what we would expect, right? Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Job's problem, he doesn't have enough knowledge. So what's Yahweh's solution going to be? Give him knowledge. But what does Yahweh do? He doesn't give him new facts. He reminds him of what he already knows. He draws his attention to the realities that God is already at work in the world in different kinds of ways. Renee? Yes. Right, that's a great word, that God is giving Job perspective. So, what is God's point to Job in 38 and 39? This was a couple weeks ago. It's good to review. The way that I worded it is that God over and over again, that's along with Renee's perspective idea, that word, God is reminding Job that he governs the world by more than justice alone. That's the thing that God is reminding Job of. And we looked at some key verses to talk about this. One of the big ones for me is when it's talking about the rain in the wilderness. Oh, let's see here. 26? Yes, that's right. 38:26. So let's start with 25. Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert? God is drawing Job's attention to the fact that God is at work making it rain in the wilderness where it does no one or nothing any good. Now, our first thoughts, right, as some kinds as ecologists, we're like, well, actually, the rain is really helpful because it causes certain plants to grow in the wilderness, da, da, da. For the purposes of Job, God is looking at Job saying, he makes it rain in the middle of the desert. Nobody's there, no animals are there, no plants are growing, and yet I'm the one that makes it rain there. Why? because it's not about justice. There's other things that are going on in the world besides justice. It's not less than justice, but there's more than justice by which God rules the world. And so this is the first point that God gives Job, that there's more than justice at work in the world. This isn't the fullness of his answer, but it is the first part of the answer. Okay. So then how does Job respond? This is all new stuff. Chapter 40. Nope. Yeah, chapter 40. It starts in verse 3 as Job's response. See, this is one of those times when the English translations just mess up with some chapter divisions. That's all right. We'll forgive them. So then Job answers Yahweh. I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. That's it. That's Job's response. All right, God, you've spoken. I'm unworthy. I place my hand over my mouth. So Job says, God, I'm going to be silent. You've spoken, and now I'm going to be silent. Okay. What kind of answer is this? What is Job's attitude? Textually, based on the book, what are we supposed to do with Job's answer here? Is this a good answer, a bad answer? How does it play in the book? What are some thoughts? That Job feels like he may have said too much, so I'm just not going to say anything else. Okay? Job certainly has said a lot, right? He's the character that says the most in the whole book, even more than Yahweh, even more than Elihu. What else? Here's maybe a way of getting at some of this idea, right? What is it that Job has wanted this whole time? He's wanted to talk with God, right? He's over and over again said, I long to bring the Lord to court. I want to be able to just talk to him and hear his side of it. So has Job kind of gotten what he wanted? Kinda, right? He's heard from God. At least this, right? Job knows that the relationship between he and God is not obliterated. He knows that the relationship between he and God has not been so severed that there is no union there, which is part of what Job is kind of afraid of, right? He's kind of over and over again in the speeches. It's like, God, where are you in this absence? I long for you to be present. I long to be able to bring you to court to answer you. And so here Job gives silence. Are there other ways we can take this? Anything else? Yeah, maybe he's kind of waiting on God and going, I don't know what to say, so I'm going to say nothing. What does Job not say by not talking? Maybe there's certain things, like what this is not, is it's certainly not an admission of any kind of guilt or error in any way, right? Job simply says, okay, right? You kind of can imagine for those who are married, right? Have we ever kind of taken this sort of route before? You're like, I'm not saying you're right. I'm not going to say you're wrong. I'm just not going to say anything, right? He just gives him silence. And I think one of the things we want to say is that there's something about Job's response that's insufficient. And the reason textually that we can say that is because God then continues with the next speech, right? If God had been satisfied with Job's answer, there would have been no need for the second Yahweh speech. So Job clearly does not add to any sort of fault or wrongdoing by not speaking. he just simply leaves it alone. Now, in the book, we could talk about the function of silence over and over again. Silence kind of plays in the book. That would be a fun thing to do for all of us who are going to go back and be rereading Job, is to ask, how does silence function? When the friends are asking Job to be silent, when Job is asking the friends to be silent, Elihu comes on and he's angry that the friends are silent because their silence implies that they're conceding the point. So when Job is silent, it at least suggests that he's willing to just cede the ground to Yahweh. But we won't go into all of that too far. Okay, so we know that Job is silent, but it's not ultimately sufficient. Oh, look at that. Why is a second speech needed? I already answered that, because it's not sufficient. Good. And how do we know? Because there is a second speech, right? So there's something about the silence that's not quite the fullness of what we need. Okay, any questions right now? Okay, we're crushing. All right, this is the fun part. Now we get into speech number 2, round 2. I think on your handouts, oh no, I have it on the next slide. We're going to compare Job 38, 1 through 3 with 46 through 7, and how do the similarities and differences matter? So we've done this a lot with the book, looking at similarities and differences. In the Bible, whenever you find passages that are almost copies of each other, it's normally the differences that really wind up mattering. What the authors are doing is they're saying, link these two ideas together, these two texts, but the differences are going to be the key. Okay, so first, let's start with what's the same. Anybody? Excellent. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Perfect. What else is the same? How about the first line, right? Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. There's a whirlwind that comes at the end of the Elihu speeches. And so there's a big storm that God is responding to Job in some way, right? That he's speaking to Job out of the storm. And yep, brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. So then the difference here is this red part. So in 38, 1 through 3, the first speech, he draws our attention to the problem. The problem is that Job lacks knowledge. So the answer is, I'm not going to give you new knowledge. I'm just going to remind you of what you should already know. What's the problem in the second speech? Yeah, that's right. So Yahweh is asking Job, would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? We're getting really close to the heart of the book, where Yahweh, the Lord, is asking Job, are you going to say that I'm unjust in order to show that you are just? Has Job done this? Not quite, but he maybe has gotten very, very close, right? Where he'll say things like, the Lord is the one who obscures the face of judges. The Lord, we'll look at that a little bit more, about some of Job's most extreme claims in the next couple of weeks, or maybe next week. Maybe, we'll see. But this is the key verse, right? And so what we've done, and the way we know that, is we said, look, 38, 1 through 3, and 46 through 7, they sound a lot alike. Because they sound alike, we're going to compare them to each other, and we're meaning to interpret them in light of each other. The differences are the key. So whereas speech 1 focused on knowledge, speech 2 is going to focus on God's justice and the justification of God over against Job, okay? And then we get to the fun parts of Job, right? We're going to talk about that. We're talking about that. Done. Okay. No, we're not there yet. I forgot. Behemoth and Leviathan, they're coming. Are you guys excited? I'm excited. All right. But before we get there, we get this little paragraph, 48 through 14. We won't take the time to read it fully, but he starts Yahweh speaking, saying, would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? That's the key verse. And then he kind of says, listen, Job, if you can govern the world better than God can, then you would be God's equal, right? He says, adorn yourself with glory and splendor. Clothe yourself in honor and majesty. Look at all those who are proud and humble them. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them in all the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Yahweh says, Job, if you think that retribution and justice, that you can do a better job at it than I can, be my guest, go right ahead. And if you could, then I would admit to you that your own right hand can save you. So God is drawing a distinction between himself and Job, saying, Job, there's things that I am doing that you can't do. And then we get to Behemoth and Leviathan, right? Behemoth and Leviathan, chapter 40, chapter 41, some old artists' renderings of these two animals. Now, what is our question when we normally come to the animals, Behemoth and Leviathan? When I am someone who studies the book of Job and someone finds out that I like the book of Job and they ask me a question about Behemoth and Leviathan, what is the question that you think I'm getting asked? How do these animals show the justice of God? No, that's not what I'm getting asked. What do you think I'm getting asked? What are they? Right? That's our question. We want to know what animal is Behemoth, what animal is Leviathan, right? How are we supposed to understand these animals? So we're going to take just a quick minute and talk about that. So what are some options for these animals that we've heard? Anybody? It doesn't even have to be specific, like, I think I heard that it was a this or that, but what are, just in general, what are some kinds of options? Paul? Okay, so one proposal is that it is an actual physical creature created by God that is being described in realistic terms, right? Whether presently existing or not, as a dinosaur or not, or, there's other kinds of examples, right? So some people have suggested hippos, some people have suggested crocodiles, elephants, all kinds of animals. Okay, so that's one option, is that they're actual creatures being described in more or less realistic terms. What's another option? That's the only option. One's a land creature. Yep, Behemoth seems to be more a land creature. Leviathan seems to be more of the sea creature. We do get that Behemoth opens his mouth against the Jordan River and is not moved by it. So it's at least, it's large, but it seems to be more a land animal, yeah. There are some other options. Craig? Oh, right, okay. Land animal, eating some grass. Hippopotamus. Yeah, trust in Craig. So there's the other option, right, is that the author is describing these creatures, right? These chaos creatures. Let me see, do I have any? I don't have any examples, any picture examples. That the author is describing these mythological creatures in animalistic terms, right? It would be like if I were to say something like, Zeus, the old white guy with a curly beard that's graying, with big muscles and hair that goes down not quite shoulder length, right? Like, I've described a non-existent person using language that draws a picture of what he looks like, right? So there are some who will propose that Job is describing mythological creatures in order to make the point that he's going to make, Okay, so those are the options. The significance, I think it does matter what our answer is. For this reason, I think if the book of Job here is describing merely mythological creatures, it loses some of its punch and point that the author is trying to make, right? Like, I kind of lose track of the significance of me saying something like, Cooper is better looking than Hercules. I'm glad nobody laughed. Okay, so like if you say Cooper's better looking than Hercules, you're like, well, what real significance does that kind of point have since Hercules didn't actually exist, right? So in the same way that when God is making his points to Job about these creatures and about how God has created them, it kind of loses its force if these creatures don't actually exist, especially when we look at verse 15, 40:15. Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you. That phrase, which I made along with you, is really the key reason that I think these creatures have to be actual created things rather than mythological pictures, because the point that God is making to Job is, I made these things. And it really loses the force if it's like, I just made that part up. I didn't actually make them. I could have made them. That would have been weird, but I didn't actually make them, right? So I think they have to be actual creatures. I'm not particularly concerned with identifying which creatures they are. The book of Job uses poetry. Poetry is always metaphorical and hyperbolic. And so, if someone says, like, everything has to be a literal, physical description, we've already seen in Yahweh's speeches the use of metaphor. For example, were you there when I placed the earth on its pillars? Well, nobody is expecting us to go out and find the pillars that are holding up planet Earth, right? We recognize this is metaphorical language. In the same way, it certainly can be possible that these descriptions are metaphorized, if that's a word. Metaphorical. They were made metaphorical. But I think they do have to be actual creatures that he's describing. Questions on this? That's a question we always want to ask. And the significance does matter, right? If it's you may be sitting there going, does it really matter? I think it does matter. The answer on this one, I think, does matter. If it winds up being a fake animal, I think the point of the second speech gets really dull. So I think they are actual creatures, whether dinosaurs or creatures that are unknowable today or untamable today. Okay. Moving on. So here's the key question, is let me see here. What is their function, John? What am I doing next? Okay. So why does he describe these creatures? So we're looking at Behemoth. We already talked about this, which I made along with you. God is showing his creative power over these creatures. And he's doing two things. He's not only showing his own power over these creatures, he's also showing Job's and humanity's inability to have power over these creatures. It's both points together. I, as their maker, am the only one who can control these creatures of chaos, and you, puny human, surely cannot. You cannot tame these creatures. So those are some key verses for Behemoth, 40, 15, 19, and 24. Leviathan, 41, 1, 10, and 11. My favorite is verse 8, 41, 8, talking about Leviathan. That's some sea creature. If you lay a hand on it, you'll remember the struggle and never do it again. I love that description. I don't know why. I just think that's great. It's like, yeah, you'll fight me. You'll remember. I'll give you something to remember. So these massive descriptions. Okay. So let's put some of this together here in a couple minutes. In the first speech, so we just flew through that one real quick at the beginning and kind of reviewed. We went through it more last time. What was God's approach? Was it breadth? Was he showing Job lots of things, or depth? 50-50 chance. You got it wrong. It's all right. It's breadth, right? Because he takes Job through the panoply of creation, right? He takes him and he goes, consider the ostrich. Have you considered the jackal? Have you considered the eagle? He doesn't really spend too long on any one thing. He just kind of moves them all around. Can you control the snow? How about the rain? How about the water? How about the earth and its foundations? Have you been able to do anything with the sky? How about fire and thunder and lightning? I can do all of those things, right? It's just kind of lots of questions showing Job the breadth of God's creative power for the purpose of the ruling of the world by more than just justice. So it has this, so what does this accomplish? And I'm drawn again to Renee's word of perspective, right? Like the breadth of God and the breadth of creation helps decenter Job a little bit from the middle, right? He's going, okay, this is a really big world, and there's a lot going on here. These are important building blocks. We're not all the way there yet, but this is part of what happens and what this accomplishes. Now, in this speech, is it breadth or depth? Depth, exactly, right? It's depth this time. So we went really deep on Behemoth and Leviathan, very specific, talking about the size of their tails and the armor plates that go on their back and their belly with muscles and all of these kinds of things, and a fish hook and all of this, right? So this time, Yahweh goes deeply examining two particular creatures. And these are paradigmatic creatures in that they are particularly chaotic. They don't serve an observable purpose or function in God's creation, right? When you read the book of Job, it doesn't say, but they make really great boots at the end of the day, right? Like these creatures are kind of pointless according to the book of Job. They're just powerful and weird and uncontrollable and untamable, and they don't do anybody any good for anything that we can see. And yet, God has created them too. So it's similar in that it decenters Job, not quite to the same extent. What else? What do you think? What is the depth of the analysis with these two creatures? What does this accomplish in this speech? Any thoughts? How does this hit you? Yeah, I think that's helpful. It's almost like God could have gone specific with any parts of his creation and shown Job the wonder of what it is that God is accomplishing and can accomplish. But he chooses to use these two as kind of in order to get his point across. Any other thoughts as the depth? Yes. we certainly get the idea that there is nothing in God's creation that can reliably oppose him, right? Even these massive creatures that are far beyond our ability to control and understand, even these are like, Leviathan is not some sea serpent to God. It's a rubber ducky in a tub, right? He's like, man, this is cute. You know, it's so even massive evil, chaos, right, in the moral sphere is not God's equal. I think is a fair way of extending some of these ideas. Let's see, did I? Okay. Okay, hang on. All right. Here we go. I'll stop a few minutes. Okay. So what did Job want to say? Ask God if given the chance. We already talked about this. He wanted to state his case. George Bernard Shaw, famous atheist, says, if I complain that I'm suffering unjustly, it's no answer to say, can you make a hippopotamus? I love this line, right? Because you got to love atheists, because sometimes they just can say so bluntly some of the impulses that you're kind of feeling if you're like, let yourself be honest. You're like, okay, but does this really answer Job's question? At the end of the day, you're like, okay, Leviathan, behemoth, animal, mythological creature, whatever. Is this really the best answer that God is going to give Job? Does this actually help Job? Okay, so what is God's point in this second speech? If the first speech is, Job, I rule the world by more but not less than justice. Take a stab. What are some thoughts? What do you have? What are you kind of taking away from this deep exploration into Behemoth and Leviathan that God's point is for Job? What's he saying? That's fine. Mm. Good. Okay, so God says, look at these creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, look how massive they are, uncontrollable they are. You can't do this. I'm the one who created them. And the purpose, one of the ideas, Renee, is that perhaps it says it's bigger than you. Okay. Of the two together, right? It's not, there's more than just your interests at stake here. Yeah. Right. Good. Okay, maybe I'm not going to answer every question that you have. It's not just about you. Other thoughts. If you're Job, what is God's point to you at the end of this speech, this deep dive into these crazy creatures? Which chapter, Gene? 40:19. I love it, yeah. So, yep. Yes, yeah. I go towards that side, right? So the first speech says, Job, there's things going on that you don't understand. There's more than just mere justice, that the righteous always flourish every moment of every day, and the wicked are always judged every moment of every day. Speech 1. Speech 2 says something different. Speech 2 seems to be saying, Job, I control all chaos within my sovereign control, right? All chaos is within my sovereign control. That seems to be, did I have that anywhere? Look at that. God contains all chaos within his sovereign control. Even these creatures, it seems that what God's point is that dual point. I am the creator and can control these things and approach these things, and you as a mere human cannot. It is chaotic for you, but it is in control for me. So there's two different points that Yahweh has made to Job here. And I think we even have a couple minutes to keep going. So let's see here. How do I? So I think, here's what's important, right? Like if you're putting the book of Job together in a big picture, with the Yahweh speeches really being the part where the rubber starts meeting the road, this is really where the interpretations differ. One is going to be reading the questions as genuine questions and not sarcastic questions. The second key thing that we're going to be talking that's important for the Yahweh speeches is that Job does not admit any wrongdoing. He remains consistent in that throughout the entire book. The third are these key points, like what do you think these speeches are doing? I think for George Bernard Shaw, he asked the question, is it really that comforting when the middle of your life is falling apart to be told, yeah, but can you make a hippo? Right? Like that doesn't seem to be answering Job's question. But we need to understand what those points are, right? It's not just asking about the hippo. It's making these larger theological claims. Okay, and then we get to Job's confession. And we're going to spend all of next week dealing with just these 6 verses, I think, because they're a mess. So then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Job says, you're in charge. I get it. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? And then he responds, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. That's an interesting one. Things too wonderful for me to know. But Job does know these things. Every question he's asked, he knows the answer to. That's such a weird book. Okay. And then you said, listen now and I will speak. I'll question, you will answer me. Verse 5, probably the most important verse in the whole book for me. It's probably the key verse that is underappreciated when we're putting the book of Job together. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. I don't know if it's the ESV or if it's just my translation of it. It says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen you. Something has happened to Job. I'm going to start preaching. I don't have enough time. Okay. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Oh, boy. Okay. There's 20 questions that we could have in here. What are a couple of questions that you have upon the hearing of these verses? Just list them. Let's list out some of them. Does Job need, I thought Job, what does the repentance mean? Job is repenting. What is he repenting of? What does this repentance mean? Good. What are some other questions we have? Good. So kind of at the end of the day, what's the status of the wager? Yeah. What's the status of that wager that was at the beginning? Who wins? Who's broke? Is God or Satan broke on this double or nothing bet? Good. Okay, what else? And that kind of ties into the repentance. Because if Job is repenting of something, does that mean that Satan won? How does that work? Yep. Good. What's the relationship between Job's first response and this response? He was silent, and now he gives something more. How does those relate to each other? What does the dust and ashes mean at the end? I repent in dust and ashes. What is that? What do we do with verse 5? I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen you. Is there something there? Yes, there is. These are the kinds of things we're going to look at next week. Job's confession, because the whole book really comes together in these 6 verses, and how you put the book together really determines how you answer some of these other questions, okay? So we've looked at the Yahweh speeches, we've looked at his 2 key points, and now we're going to see the resolution of the whole matter and the questions that God does answer for Job, the questions that God does not answer for Job, and why that matters for us, the perspective piece, and it's just so neat the way he puts it all together. Okay, all right. 2 weeks left, I think. 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks left.